This is John Jackson Miller. I am the founder and curator of Comichron.com, the world's largest public database of comic book sales figures. Here today to talk about The Avengers, a very famous title from Marvel, and a specific set of sales information that we have on this series, or actually a collection of series, which comes from the publisher's filings with the United States Postal Service. Now, this is something that probably people may not be as familiar with as, say, the comics sales figures that we run estimates for on Comichron.com for Diamond Comic distributors and the other distributors that sold to comic shops over the years. But it's a very important data set, and one that I've collected 95, maybe 98% of the existing records for painstakingly over the last 20, 25 years. The reason is that this is a set of data where the publishers, as a consequence of the being able to send their comics second class or periodical class, as it's known today, through the Postal Service, since 1960, as required by U.S. Code Section 4369 and then later 3685, they have had to report to the Postal Service not just who owns the company that's putting out the comics, putting that material into the mail, but they also have had to say how many copies they sold. Later on, they would have to say how many subscription copies they sold and various other things. And these are things that I think that people who have read comics for years will be familiar with, because if you look back at old comics, the letters pages of comics that were sold by subscription, once a year, usually November, December, January, you would begin seeing comics that would have these forms in them. This is actually the very first form that Archie comics, in their main Archie title, had to file for that series with actual numbers in them. This was from an issue that came out in 1961, reporting on 1960 sales figures. And at that time, they only had to report just the bottom line, the total number of copies sold for every issue. 458,000 is the number here. But in later years, there would be quite a lot of additional data. To look at the Avengers specifically right now, the data set that I have open for Avengers, which is now a closed data set because I have all the information that ever appeared in the title, takes in the first Avengers series, which starts 1963, goes all the way until 1996, when, as a result of faltering sales coming from the collapse of the industry in the days after the market boom of the early 90s, Marvel turned over 4 of its titles to Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld in something called Heroes Reborn. And so for a time, the Avengers and several other characters were sort of in their own universe. This necessitated rebooting the series with a new number 1. However, it's the same title as far as the Postal Service was concerned. They used the same license to actually sell the comics. Same thing when they rebooted it with Kurt Busiek and George Perez in 1998, Heroes Return. The statements of ownership in that magazine that were reporting sales figures were referring to the subscription base that was already getting Avengers all this time. The subscriber list basically went from one magazine to the next as far as the Postal Service and Marvel's record keeping was concerned. This continued when they changed the numbering in 2004. This is Avengers 500. They went back and restored the original numbering. This was the Avengers Disassembled storyline. Fun fact, and I guess fair disclosure here, I did write one of the prologue pieces for Avengers Disassembled over in the Iron Man series. But the result of this storyline was that we get yet another name change, another new number 1 for Avengers. This is New Avengers number 1. This comes out in 2005. Again, this is the same subscription base that had been getting Avengers, and even though they did file for a new postal license, it was the same group of people still getting the book who had been paying for it. And so, at least as far as my records are concerned, it's all one series. This is the case as well when they rebooted again as New Avengers in 2010. Now, there were several Avengers series that came after this, and as they redid the numbering again and again and again. However, these are the only series that we're interested in with regard to the Postal Service and the postal data for sales figures, and I'll tell you why here as we look at the actual data. Here we are in the title spotlight section of Comichron on the Avengers page. Now, the title spotlights are something we do where even though we have postal sales information for over 500 titles that ran data in the back of the magazines or ran the forms, for specific titles, ones of specific interest, we have placed all of the data that is relevant, that's important. We just decided we would show everything that there is to know about the title. And you can get to this page and to get to all these individual records by going to the Sales by Title page. And this is on the menu of every page in Comichron. You can actually find all of the postal data that we've got. Well, at least what we've got posted at the moment in the postal data section, which can be found under yearly sales. To look specifically at the Avengers, what we'll find here is that first it says the postal record is complete. I have found in the hundreds of issues of the Avengers over the years all of the statements of ownership that did run that have circulation numbers in them. I also was able to isolate and make sure that the years that we did not find any forms in, that nothing existed. We just didn't miss something someplace. There were some years skipped for various reasons, as we'll see below. Now, this data, as it's reported on the page here, is summarized in a couple of different places. First of all, on the left-hand column here, we sort of say what the numbering runs through that you're looking at on the page itself here of the series. We are able to say, there were 49 years in which Avengers could have run statements. 43 statements were confirmed found. 6 years we confirmed that the Marvel skipped running statements when they should have run them. And what we also do here is we kind of summarize what we believe the total number of comics that Marvel sold according to these statements. If we take these averages that are sort of per issue averages that are reported over the years, and then multiply it by the number of comics that came out in the year. And so what we see is that from 1963 to 2011, which is the period during which Marvel was filing circulation statements for this magazine, there were between 125 and 135 million copies sold. And again, to sort of dig into how the series went over the years, one way you can look at it is in the average sales per issue section over here on the left. And what this is these annual total paid circulation figures summarized here year by year, and these refer to the number of copies of each issue. The average 1977 issue, for example, sold 168,164 copies. And one of the things that's interesting about this data set is that, distinct from what we see in Diamond or the other direct market distributors that released public sales figures over the years, those were never complete. They were just what this particular distributor sold to comic shops. There were a number of things that were missed. One of the things that was always missed was newsstand sales. That's counted in here. Direct market sales would be counted in here. Subscription sales are counted in here. Even the number of copies that they set aside to send out as samples in the mail or at conventions counted in these numbers. Even the office copies that weren't distributed, these are counted. So this is Marvel asserting to the Postal Service, hey, you asked for everything we know about what we sold last year for this title. Here's what you wanted to know. And so that's why this is such an important data set. And Sadly, as the years go by and fewer comics are sold by subscription, fewer and fewer publishers needed to report this information. And indeed, as we'll see here, they stopped running it in any of the Marvel titles after 2011. They started running them, however, in Avengers in 1966. This is around when Marvel began running filings in sort of the Silver Age titles that it had launched. So Amazing Spider-Man's first form is in 1966. Fantastic Four's first form appears in 1966. They were taking advantage of sort of that grace period that seemed to exist with the Postal Service for a few years back in those days, where they just didn't report anything for several years. Marvel was reporting on some of the titles that had been going longer, like Tales of Suspense, Tales to Astonish, Strange Tales. That's why we do have data for the early 1960s for those titles. But we just don't have anything before what would have appeared in 1966 here. And this did appear in issue 38. It was the March 1967 issue. This first filing was dated October 1st, 1966, and it more or less reports the 1966, some 1965, but mostly 1966 sales. And we can see here that right away, early on, they were doing almost 270,000 copies per month of the magazine. It was 12 times a year, as the records show here, and it was 12 cents, $1.75 for an annual subscription. Pretty good deal, probably back in the day, and even now, certainly now, but back in the day, it was probably a good deal. And we can see here that by 1966, the Postal Service was requiring a lot more than just the bottom line number. They were asking number of copies sold by subscription, big round number here, 2,000. And then what we're able to do, because we know what the print run was, because Marvel was required to report this, we can guess we can figure out what the average number of copies returned each month was. So one of the fun things that we've added here, these things in gray are not actually part of the forms that were reported, but we did the math ourselves, and so we know that of these 423,000 copies that were printed, 36% of the run was returned. They were printing 8 to sell 5. Again, this is average by across all the issues of the year. They did not report sales for issue 35, issue 36, issue 37. It was for the entire year of 1966. And so, it's not the case that these are the exact numbers for any one of those given issues during the year, but it's a good approximation. You will see in those forms where it does say closest issue to filing date, what the sales were for this particular comic book series for that issue. We do not record that information at Comichron, and for years we've been telling people to disregard it because back in those days, the publishers did not have timely information as to the number of comics that were returned from distributors. And so the numbers that they would have of the most recent issues that they just sent to press would be distorted wildly because they wouldn't have any copies sent back or reported as destroyed by the distributors that the retailers weren't able to sell. So we only look at the average annual figures. What we see here is that as the 60s go on, Avengers begins to trail off, as just about everything else does, as the newsstand market begins to suffer, and this continues into the 70s. But Avengers doesn't really suffer as badly as some other titles. Certainly as badly as some other titles of other genres besides superheroes or other publishers besides Marvel. They do fairly. It does fairly well. You'll notice that there's some errors here. These are actually math errors that were found in the statements that came out for 1971 and for 1972. And these are the corrected numbers as we have done the math. So every so often, this sort of thing will just crop up, and we're able to put the correct information out there whenever we can. 1975, you'll notice no form was printed. Marvel was going through editors-in-chief fairly frequently in the 1970s, and it was the rare Marvel title that did not accidentally skip a year. And 1975 is a year that was definitely skipped, but we can kind of guess that the sales for that year were probably somewhere between 188 and 172,000, 173,000, which was the 1976 figure. We see the numbers starting to improve here at the end of the end of the 70s. We have Jim Shooter writing here for the title for a while. We get into the late 1970s. We have the direct market beginning to come into the picture, and so even as in this era the percentage of the print run being returned was fairly high because of the failure of the newsstand distribution market, this number begins to go down. This percentage begins to go down over the years because less and less comics are being thrown at the newsstands basically blindly, hoping that they'll sell. So this number will continue going down and down and down as we get through the 1980s and 90s, and finally it just about disappears as the newsstand presence of Marvel titles winds down completely. And so we see the series fairly stable throughout the 1980s, and it does have another missing form in 1988. Another erroneous issue where they just didn't print the date that the filing was supposed to have taken place. That's no big deal. We kind of know when that was. And once we hit 1990, though, Avengers does not really improve along with the rest of the comics market when the boom is happening. The boom, which is roughly gauged as 1990 to 1993. This is the bubble market for the comics industry. Why is that the case? I believe that the reason is that when we get into the late 1980s and early 1990s, Avengers fissions off into multiple titles because for all of the earlier 1980s, you just had one Avengers series. Well, now you get down here, we've got West Coast Avengers running, we've got solo Avengers running, just multiple titles coming out. And then for each of the Avengers characters, if you're following them as well, well, they've got multiple titles running at the same time. So you've got Thor, and you've got Thunderstrike, and you've got just various spin-off versions of these other different characters. And it just becomes more expensive to carry everything or to buy everything. And then, of course, it's also getting more expensive in general. One of the things that we have, as you can see, the cover price continuing to go up over the years. And as mentioned earlier, we get to the mid-1990s. The series drops below, fairly quickly below 100,000 copies per issue in 1995. This prompts what happens in Heroes Reborn, and it is a big month. The first issue is of Avengers rebooted is up in the 200,000s, and one reason that 1997 is higher than 96 is in part because 1997 is more fully a Heroes Reborn year. 1996. This form was filed October 1st, 1996. So there's only 1 month's data that could possibly be counted from Heroes Reborn. That's the very first issue, Volume 2, Number 1. And that is the reason why we see it hop from 85,000 to 123,000. But we don't really see it ballooning until 97 and then 98. By this point, the reboots are over. This series is suffering from the malaise of the rest of the comic shop market that continues into the early 2000s. And we can kind of see here, this is right when that Avengers Disassembled event happens. In fact, it's in issue 503 that the final statement of ownership in the original series, once they renumbered it again in 2004, comes out. And you'll note that we go from 73,000 copies a year at this point to suddenly a lot higher once we're in Brian Michael Bendis's era. There is no form printed in 2005 because, again, when they shifted from Avengers to New Avengers, they filed a new postal license, even though they carried over the subscribers from Avengers from the previous series to the next one. They were apparently under no obligation to run a form, or at least they didn't do it. And we see the numbers continuing to be over 100,000 copies through the end of the decade. Then we have that reboot of Avengers, reboot of New Avengers, running out of nouns to use here, that takes place in 2010, and once again, new application is filed, but they still use the same subscription file. The number of subscribers that we see reflected, 6,900 subscribers. That's still quite a lot in 2009. These make the jump into the new series 2010. Once we get to 2011, we're now in an era where Marvel is really not emphasizing subscriptions by mail anymore. When was the last time you saw a subscription ad in the comics? And so for that reason, here on out after 2012, there are no more circulation statements filed by Marvel, and that's the end of it. You will note here that also it's the end of the sales to the newsstand at this point. Very few copies were counted as not distributed, meaning that they were sent to the newsstand and not sold. But again, this is a data set which you can square up with the Diamond sales figures. You just go to the monthly reports pages that we have, and you can follow along individual months and see as this section builds out. You can see, for example, that first month where Avengers number 1, volume 2, number 1. Has, there we go, 276,734 copies pre-ordered in its first month. That definitely impacts the annual averages, but these numbers are the total figures. These are everything. These are under penalty of law, the numbers. As they reported them to the Postal Service. We do summarize these numbers over here as mentioned, and it is sort of interesting to see in these numbers reflections of not just what's going on in the title itself with changes of creators, but also sort of the wider things that were going on in the direct market, both with the fortunes of the comic shops and then also with the fortunes of the newsstand, and with the change in the way that people looked at comic books by subscription. So that's the Avengers Postal Database, and until next time, we'll see you in the comic shop.